In the election of 1960, the first televised debate between Republican candidate Richard Nixon and Democrat John F. Kennedy was viewed by 70 million Americans. These debates provided John F. Kennedy with a means to overcome voters' inhibitions over his youth, his inexperience, and his religion, Catholicism. The debates not only proved Kennedy was able to hold his own against Nixon, but contrasted his good looks with Nixon's haggard, sick appearance. But what would have happened if Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's running mate, had kept the equal time rule in place in the 1960 election? Johnson, who at that time was the Senate Majority Leader, had the opportunity to vote against lifting the equal time rule, which would have required that all 14 parties running in the election would have equal television time. Because Johnson and Kennedy's relationship was relatively strained, it was possible that Johnson's lack of faith in Kennedy's debating skills could have caused him to vote to keep the equal time rule in place, and influence others to do so as well. If this rule remained in place, there was no possibility that all 14 political parties would receive equal airtime, and therefore the election would not have been televised. Without the televised debates, it is unlikely that Kennedy would have won the election. With major figures of the Democratic Party, such as Eleanor Roosevelt, against him because they felt he bought the nomination, Kennedy could never have overcome the odds stacked against him. While the televised debates did not win Kennedy support from Democrats like Eleanor Roosevelt, they did win over people who felt Kennedy was too inexperienced to even compete with Nixon in the debates. Kennedy's suave appearance was able to easily win viewers over. Nixon, who had to spend the debates defending the Eisenhower administration, was at a huge disadvantage by not being able to take the offensive. Before the debates, the Gallup poll showed Nixon ahead by 47 to 46%, with 7% undecided, and after it showed Nixon behind with 51 to 54% with 4% undecided. Had it not been for the televised debates, Nixon surely would have won the presidency in the 1960 election. While Kennedy and Nixon had similar goals, they had very different strategies. The Bay of Pigs, an idea initially formulated by Eisenhower, is a clear example of their divergences. The invasion on April 17, 1961, which included 1,400 Cuban exiles trained by the CIA, was initially designed to have air raids simultaneously.
So just why was this operation destined to fail?
For all kinds of political reasons, American troops could not be seen to be invading Cuba. The political risks were far too high, including possible war with the USSR.
I think if you're looking at, sort of small paramilitary groups of less than 2,000, taking on 35,000 sort of seasoned troops, well, it's a no-brainer. But the fact is, they're going to be killed.
During the Vietnam War. With the air raids, it is likely that the Bay of Pigs would have been successful in overthrowing Cuba's communist government in 1961. Because of Nixon's policy of new federalism, where he advocated the allocation of funds to the states in order to handle domestic issues, and because Nixon would have wanted to reduce government spending, the civil rights movement would not have been supported by the federal government had he been elected president. This means the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would not have been passed. Because of the rise in tensions, mounted especially in the 1960 sit-ins and the 1961 Freedom Rides, riots would ensue, causing the federal government to have to step in. Nixon, who would have needed white Southerners' votes in his re-election campaign, would need to respond to these riots and this growth of violence in a way that would appease his constituency. As a result, an executive order would have been issued protecting the American people and putting federal troops in areas of chaos. Kennedy played a major role in getting the United States involved in the Vietnam War. He was the person that sent the Green Berets to act as military advisors in Vietnam. By the time Kennedy died, there were 16,000 Green Berets in Vietnam. Once again, Nixon's new federalism would have radically changed the United States' place in the war. Since Nixon would have wanted to cut military spending, United States presence in the war would have been far more limited. Vietnam roused the protests of many, such as in the 1965 teach-ins on the steps of Congress. It acted as a warning to the United States when getting involved in foreign affairs, and made Americans less willing to get involved in foreign wars. Without this warning sign, it is likely the response from Americans after 9/11 would have been more similar to the response after Pearl Harbor, and people would have been less hesitant to retaliate. While the omission of the televised debates could have caused Kennedy to lose the 1960 election, this also would have meant that Lyndon B. Johnson would never have been president. Creator of such domestic programs as Medicare and Medicaid in his Great Society, Lyndon B. Johnson set the precedent for the federal government's involvement in health care. Medicare and Medicaid provided health care to people with low-income housing and senior citizens. Obama, who currently passed the Affordable Health Care Act in 2009, could not have successfully put this act into motion without some sort of precedent, ensuring that it was constitutional for the federal government to have control over health care. It is likely that as a result, the act would have been overridden as unconstitutional, on the grounds that Congress does not have the right to regulate health care, since it is not a commodity that goes between state lines. Indeed, domestic life would have been vastly different today had Nixon won the 1960 election, especially in terms of civil rights. Kennedy's Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 demonstrated federal initiative in desegregation, unlike when Eisenhower intervened in desegregating Little Rock Central High School, primarily to assert federal power over the states. While Eisenhower's actions did not show true support for desegregation, Kennedy's New Frontier did. When peering into the hypothetical future after Nixon's presidency, it is likely that students and historians would view the world around them and see racism and segregation. It is also likely that they would look to the past and find that had Kennedy been president, civil rights would have been more progressive. With the decision of Lyndon B. Johnson not to lift the equal time rule, and without the televised debates in the 1960 election, the immediate and far-reaching effects are abundant. Insignificant as it may seem, the snap of a remote control denying Kennedy the limelight he needed to achieve the presidency would have led to radical domestic and foreign changes in the history of the United States.